Okay. You said you had some answers. Oneness. Uh-huh. What else? Self-knowledge, self-understanding, self-organizing, yes. And
Self-operating?
Yes, self-operating, right. And isn't it also that the sense of the infinite self-containment of being? That divine science is that which is infinitely self-containing. Do you hear the love sense coming in? That infinite self-containment now, the all-encompassing, again, a love tone. It's the all in all, love tone. The oneness of the one. A self-operation of being. I'm just recalling, I don't have the quote with me, but I'm recalling something that David Bohm says about the fact that everything comes from the holo movement, and that the holo movement is a great ground, a background, a total background of feedback. That the holo movement is the movement of a feedback ground, of a field, an infinite field of feedback. I must get that straight for you this afternoon. And that every fluctuation comes from this field. That every fluctuation is the whole field of feedback. Moving, individualized, we would say. And so on the level of divine science, we get the first appearing of that term, feedback, because divine principle love is the self-feedback principle. The divine self-feedback principle. Which means what? That principle is referring to itself. It is how the system organizes itself, how the divine system structures itself, self-organizes, reorganizes, how it operates in an infinite God genesis, namely through its calculus, through the cybernetic idea, out of itself, through itself, as itself, for itself. You know that Mrs. Eddy says somewhere in prose works that in divine science, God is one and all, and governing himself, you see, it's a self-government. Governing himself, he governs the universe. These two are, every level. So that that self-government is the government at every level. And divine science shows us that circuit, that feedback circuit that is the self-government and the government for every further level. At every further level will find its source, its origin, its power, its authority in divine science, from divine science. So we see here that the word of life, the Christ truth, the love of Christianity, and the divine principle love, which is the science standpoint itself, constitutes that divine orbit within which being continually moves, eternally moves. This is the principle then of self-organization, how principle organizes itself, structures itself, restructures itself, that all restructuring comes from this principle, from this pattern. We find in divine science the pattern. It is a self-regulating. It regulates itself, that is to say, controls itself, steers itself, guides itself. But I think that self-regulating has a very scientific tone to it. The moment we hear guiding itself and steering itself, we may feel that there's a translated sense to a level that needs to have guidance and steering, but behind that lies the fact of the self-regulation, the self-governing of that system. On this level, we see that being is self-iterating, so that the self-referring that we saw as inherent in being itself becomes the self-iterating of divine science. And to iterate something is to keep on repeating it. It keeps on repeating itself. In fact, in mathematics, the definition of iteration is to keep repeating a calculation. And here you see what is behind that, is that there is only one calculus, only one fundamental calculation, one calculus. The Word, the Christ, Christianity, science, life, truth, love as the divine principle, love, is the one calculus, and it is iterated and reiterated infinitely. It means to feed a calculation back in on itself, and this is exactly what divine science does. It feeds itself back in on itself, and in so doing eternally brings out what we call a God Genesis. And so this, the cybernetic sense at this point includes the self-steering. It isn't at this point steering us or guiding us, but it is a self-steering, self-directing. It is recursive. This is another term, meaning that it turns back always on itself, never refers to anything outside. There is nothing outside, because this is the infinite self-containment of being. It is the closed system. It is the one infinite closed system. Being the one infinite closed system, there is no other system apart from the divine system of divine science. But what we will see is that that infinite closed system includes all open systems, all what could be called other systems. There's only one closed system as such, includes all open systems within it, because divine science includes within itself absolute Christian science and Christian science. Those levels where we find open systems. So here we have the model of a perfect closed system. You know that in nature they had felt for many hundreds of years that there were closed systems. But as they looked into them, they found that every closed system had a certain degree of openness in it, that it could not be entirely closed or it would be dead. A closed system is a dead system. And so there are only systems that are partially closed or tend toward being closed. But a living system is, generally speaking, an open system. Actually, we will find, I have to qualify that, we will find that a healthy, living system, a system at the point of perfection, is organizationally closed and energetically open, environmentally open. What else do we have here? Cyclical. You see that feedback implies that there is a cyclical process going on, a circular process going on, circularity. There's a circularity in the, if you want to say, in the reasoning, or in the, if we reason along the lines, see, even if we reason step by step, linearly along the lines of divine science, we reason in a circularity. We reason from the Word to the Christ, to Christianity, to science, and back to the Word again. Never leaving that field, that circularity of divine science. It is a closed loop. This becomes a closed loop. A feedback loop. And a feedback loop corresponds to a non-linear process. So even though we start by reasoning linearly, we find that we are caught up in the non-linearity of divine science, caught up in the cybernetic closed loop, a non-linear process of iteration. That's the feedback loop, the closed loop. And finally, we see that it is the pattern. I'm missing a lot of good things here. Yes. Let me, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about pattern and about feedback. You know that the model of being will always appear to us to be mechanical and mechanistic until we understand the concept of feedback. The moment we touch the concept of feedback and understand the idea of feedback, then it's a living system to us and no more mechanical. You know what I mean by that mechanical sense? It may be what we had in the beginning when we would say, where shall I go now? What should I look at now? Should I look at which level should I be on? And what standpoint should I take? Should I take the Word in divine science, or should I take the Christ in absolute Christian science? What shall I do? As though you were asking from the outside and asking outside of the system itself where to go, how to get into the system, and where to go in the system. This indicates that we don't have a consciousness of the idea of feedback. Our sense of it is mechanistic. if we don't consciously acknowledge the Christ activity, if we're not consciously understanding the Christ activity, and I think that this week we will more and more understand that and feel that that feedback principle is the activity of the Christ idea. And that takes the mechanical sense out of our perception of the model of being. So wherever you have feedback, you have love. Feedback is a sign of divine love. It is a circular arrangement of causally connected elements. A feedback loop is a circular arrangement of causally connected elements. And the consequence of this arrangement is that the first link, the input, is finally affected by the last link, or the output, which results in the feeding back. And in that feeding back is the self-regulation of the entire system. So the feedback not only implies love, it implies self-regulation, the regulating of the system. Governing himself, he governs the universe. Regulating himself, he regulates the universe. So that when we understand feedback, we understand that all causality is circular. All causality is circular causality. Love working through feedback loops. That's how love works, through feedback loops. And feedback is the conveying of information about the outcome of any process back to its source. You hear word Christ, Christianity there. So you have information as the outcome. Information about what? About the process, right? You have the output of information as Christianity. Information about what? The Christ, or the process. And the feeding of that back to the source. Word, right? Is that clear? Does that make sense? You have a source. A source is the point of input of the word. And you have that input being processed by the Christ. And you have, as an outcome, or as an output, information. It's actually information about the Word and the Christ that is fed back by science to the source. That's just a very general definition.
We think of information as the input.
It is.
So that's what the
Uh-huh. You input information, and that information is processed. It is reorganized by the self-organizing principle, and the outcome is new information, which is then fed back to the source. Yeah. Uh-huh. I wanted to tell you a little bit more about self-organization. This is a concept actually that didn't come up until the late 1970s. and had actually been implicit in the work of the cyberneticists in the 40s, but it was not articulated until the late 70s, 30 years later. And they say that self-organization is the central concept in any theory of living systems today. And what does that self-organization involve? It involves understanding a pattern. Understanding the pattern of self-organization, they say, is the key to understanding the essential nature of life. That's why you see that I have here pattern. You see, right? Pattern. That to understand the phenomenon of self-organization, we first need to understand the importance of pattern, something that you and I have talked a lot about over the last several years, and now we see the place value of that issue of pattern, of what the pattern is that is being patterned across scale. What do they mean by pattern? The idea of a pattern of organization is a configuration of relationships. A configuration of relationships characteristic of a particular system. And here it is a pattern, or the pattern for the organization for all life, for life. The properties of a living system, Capra says this, the properties of a living system are the properties of a pattern. They arise from a configuration of ordered relationships. It's so beautiful if you can grasp it, if you can see it, that on the level of divine science is the pattern for all self-organization, the pattern of organization for all living systems. And how is that pattern diversified? How do we get the infinite diversification of that pattern? We get it through the laws of absolute Christian Science. Absolute Christian Science takes that one pattern and is able to diversify, classify, individualize that, specify that infinitely, without measure. A configuration of ordered relationships. That's a pattern. Isn't that what an idea is? A configuration of ordered relationships. You see that an idea is a system. Every idea is a system. That we have the pattern on the level of divine science. Actually, on the level of divine science, you know that you have appearing for the first time the 7 and the 4. You have the operation, the divine self-operation of being. Well, the divine self-operation of mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, and love. And so you have the pattern of the nature and the pattern of the operation as the fundamental pattern for all being. And then you have the laws of absolute Christian Science, which take that pattern and say every idea is an idea of life, truth, and love. Every idea is an idea of the self-organizing principle. And so we have the level of Christian Science that says actually every experience is an experience of the self-organizing principle. Every experience is an experience of an idea of life, truth, and love. The pattern. Does that make any sense, Joe? And they say, well, what is destroyed when a living system, say you take a living system and you dissect that living system, what is it you actually destroy when you dissect it? You destroy the pattern. You destroy the pattern. The components are still there, but the configuration of the relationships has been interrupted. The pattern has been destroyed, and thus the system dies. So if you take away the pattern, you take away life. The pattern is life. Life is the pattern. It's a sort of a new 7,000-year period definition of death. Deprive something of its pattern. And this is death. This is destruction. And so these scientists are actually saying that there is something to life that is non-material and irreducible, and that's its pattern of organization. And here we sit in this classroom looking at the fundamental pattern of organization for the sum total of being, for the whole of being. And this is divine science. The pattern of being. Okay. All right. You remember where we were before we broke for lunch? We have been looking at the level of divine science and had seen something very beautiful about self-organization. That the principle of self-organization is that principle which always shows itself forth in a pattern of organization. And that there is therefore something to life, something to the living system, whether we call that living system our consciousness as a dynamic, living, evolving system, or we think of our experience again as a dynamic, evolving system, or we may take the textbook as a living system, or a chapter of the textbook as a living system, or an idea as a living, dynamic system. That which all of these living systems have in common is a pattern of organization, which is non-material and irreducible. And when they ask the question, is there a common pattern? Is there something common about this pattern? In other words, something about the pattern of life that you see in every case, then they say yes, that which is common is that it is always a network pattern. The pattern is a network. Whenever we look at life, at that which expresses life, we look at networks. This is the general pattern of life. So looking at our divine system of reference as the fundamental, deep structure pattern for all being, for the sum total of being, we can see that that pattern is the self-organizing principle love as the fourfold operative principle, as its own self-input, as the word of life, its own self-processing as the Christ truth, its own self-output as Christianity, love, and its own self-feedback as science or divine principle love. So it is the fourfold operative principle as one eternal circuit. This is the pattern. One eternal circuit expressing itself as the sevenfold principle in its nature, and therefore expressing itself as its own divine information principle, its own ordering principle as spirit, its own identity principle as soul, its own self-organizing principle as principle, its own redundancy principle as life, its own principle of wholeness or holism as truth, and its own integration principle as love. So that from the standpoint of mind, the self-organizing principle is the information principle. From the standpoint of spirit, the self-organizing principle is the ordering principle of itself and consequently of the whole universe. Governing himself, he governs the universe. Can you hear that? From the standpoint of soul, the self-organizing principle becomes the identity principle. That which identifies everything. We're going to see this translated right down to our beautiful chapter on prayer this week. So that everything that we do in these early hours and days is going to be wrought out in that text, seen in that text. And so we have the fourfold operative principle operating in its sevenfold nature. And this is then the pattern for everything in being, or the sum total of being. So now we can take up the level of absolute Christian Science. Let's see if I have the right one. Yes. When we come to absolute Christian Science, remember that first in divine science, we saw that innate or intrinsic rhythm or activity of being as the nature and character of the self-organizing principle itself. And now we are going to see the way in which that self-organizing principle works. How does it work? How does love organize itself? It will organize itself always by referring to itself and bringing out the symmetry, the self-symmetry of being, the self-similarity of being. Actually, I could say that love organizes through pattern across scale, but I have actually placed that terminology down on the level of Christian Science, and feel that behind the phenomenon of pattern across scale lies the self-similarity of being, or the self-symmetry of being. How does love organize? It always organizes through itself, through the principle, as life, truth, and love in its sevenfold nature, and thus is continually bringing out the symmetry, or the symmetrical forms of life, truth, and love. What do we have as our... Yes, individualized. You see, now we get the individualized forms of oneness, the individualized forms of self-organization, forms of the divine cybernetic idea. In other words, we see on the level of absolute Christian Science the field, the whole field of cybernetic ideas. So the symmetry of life, truth, and love becomes the pattern for every idea. You remember in the prose works at the point of the colloquy is that question about the form. Isn't it a question about the form of the new child, or the... Do you remember the Christ idea, something like that? What will his form be? And she says, he is wholly symmetrical. And so every idea is wholly symmetrical, has the form of its self-organizing principle, has the form that love gives to it. So you have those two terms there, symmetry and self-similarity. When the 7 and the 4 are iterated and reiterated, they bring out these forms that are symmetrical with their principle, that have the same symmetry, the same form, the same balance as their principle. But through the laws of absolute Christian Science, they find, these ideas find their individuality. They attain their individuality so that they are absolutely distinct from one another, even though they have the same symmetry. They are self-symmetrical, but they are unique. And this uniqueness is conveyed by the term self-similarity. That means that they are similar to each other in their pattern of organization, and yet they have their own identity, their own individuality. So they are similar but not the same. Can you see that? This wonder goes throughout nature, and it is a phenomenon that was found really by the scientists working on the phenomenon of chaos, that as they looked into chaos, you know that they began to find a deep order, or a super order. And that super order has to do with complexity, and in researching the origin of complexity, this source of complexity, they found that it came from iteration, from reiteration, that there is a calculation. Remember we said there's a calculation, and it keeps feeding back in on itself. It feeds itself back in. You recall back on the level of divine science, we had iteration or reiteration, and I said to you at that point that we have a calculation that keeps feeding in on itself, that the divine infinite calculus can do nothing but feed on itself. It feeds to itself, on itself, out of itself, through itself, as itself, for itself. And so we see that this is the origin for the preserving of the pattern and for the infinite diversification of that pattern. Isn't that a wonder, that you can diversify something and yet not lose it, not lose its fundamental identity? And so in nature, when they investigate the complexity of nature, they find that mathematically can be found behind everything a calculation, a specific calculation. Say behind a tree, or a certain type of a tree, say an oak tree, that there will be a pattern, a deep pattern, and that there is a calculation, apparently, that stands behind that pattern. And when you iterate and iterate and iterate that pattern, that calculation, you bring out the whole variety of the tree. And so you can look at that tree, you can look at any kind of a tree, I'm looking out at a tree right now, and I can look at any branch, any twig on a branch, any leaf on a twig, and at any point on that tree there is complete self-similarity. And yet you see that behind that is a form of self-symmetry that is expressed as self-similarity, and in that expression every leaf finds its individuality from every other leaf. This is what is meant. You have heard of fractals, fractal geometry. Actually, the geometry in nature, the geometry of trees and plants and landforms and so forth, mountains and everything, is all fractal geometry. And when these computer scientists, for instance, like Benoit Mandelbrot, take a calculation and feed it in to a program and keep feeding the same iteration in, keep iterating that calculation, what first appears seems to be random, seems to have no order in it at all. But you keep on feeding in. See, this says something beautiful about our method of working in science, because this is our method, isn't it? To go back, to go to the calculus, to keep going over the calculus, to calculate with the calculus, to go through the four, to stay with the four, and not feel after doing that one or two times that this is just random, this just isn't producing anything, nothing is happening, but to iterate and reiterate and reiterate. You see that patterns our method. It patterns our way of working, our way of practice, to go over the 7 and the 4, to go over and over and over, to keep feeding that in, feeding consciousness with that pattern. And so what first appears seems to be nothing, just random, and as the process continues, something begins to show forth, and it looks chaotic. It doesn't look like order at all, but you keep feeding it in, feeding in that calculation, and what emerges is an incredible pattern of order, of complexity. You know the Mandelbrot set? The Mandelbrot set, yeah. How many don't know the Mandelbrot set? Oh, yeah. I should have brought a transparency of it, but it's a student on the other coast told me that there was a special PBS program on the Mandelbrot set, was an hour long, and they said that they would take 4-minute sections of time, not even talking, but just moving through this fractal, moving through this, showing you the different, you see the self-similarity. It's a pattern of self-similarity. And you think, you look at it from a certain distance and you think, oh yes, here's something here, and then there's a big thing here and something here, and then over here there's a little thread coming out, and then here's the very same thing that was all here, and another thread out here, and the same thing, and then you look closer and there's a tiny, tiny thread, and these threads all going out and repeating the pattern. You see the symmetry, the basic pattern remains the same, and yet if you look closely at each instance of that pattern, you see that every instance is unique, that there is something about it that makes it unique. And so this is the self-similarity. And this is the way nature works. And I would bet my life on it that it's because of the laws of absolute Christian Science. That it is those laws that are bringing forth the infinite variety of the one pattern and filling the universe with forms, individual forms of the one pattern. Isn't that true, what we see in those laws? The law of life, truth, and love as the law of impulsion that takes the principle, takes that self-organizing principle, draws everything from that self-organizing principle, and really is bringing forth the individualities of the infinite individuality of the self-organizing principle. And it is that law of the Christ. They speak so much about a selection, there being a selection ability in being, in nature. The ability to select perfectly, to choose perfectly what has to be brought forth. And that is certainly what the law of truth, life, and love does. That it takes the whole of truth, whether you want to think of that as the whole of the self-organizing principle of divine science, or if you want to think of it as the whole field of ideas that are impelled forth by life, truth, and love as the individualities of that self-organizing principle, that truth, life, and love are able to select the exact, perfect, tailor-made form at that point. And so every idea that is selected by the selection principle of the Christ, the individualizing, translating power and ability of the Christ, is preserved and conserved by the law of life and love, and in fact is held, eternally held, in the law of truth and love, the law of pre-established or pre-stabilized perfection, where every form is held eternally in its perfection. So these are the laws that stand behind everything we see at the further level of Christian Science. Isn't that a wonder? Does anybody think that's a wonder beside me? So can you hear a bit of a difference? I'm just actually learning it, sensing it myself, the difference between the self-symmetry and the self-similarity. The self-symmetry, that every idea would have the same pattern, and the self-similarity, that it expresses that pattern in a unique way.
The deep structure and surface structure?
In a way, in a sense, yes. Yeah. Okay. What else do we have? We have, as at the previous level, the phenomenon of feedback. And here it is the positive feedback principle. Feedback is a general pattern of life. Here we see that we fall right back to divine science, that there can be no feedback on the levels of absolute and Christian Science, were the whole feedback principle not an aspect of the divine principle, love itself. And so it becomes a general pattern for all of life. And here it is, the positive feedback principle, and this might be a good place to remind ourselves of the quality of the positive feedback principle and the negative feedback principle. Know that the negative feedback principle is found in and as the level of Christian Science with its 4 great orders and laws. I say this because when we say negative feedback, we tend to connect to that terminology something that is negative. Somebody talks to us about negative feedback, we think, oh, I don't want any of that, I want the positive feedback. And this really indicates to ourselves that we don't yet understand the nature of the negative feedback, or else we would know that both the positive feedback and the negative feedback are positive. Both are of a positive nature. In fact, if we were to look at these 2 feedback mechanisms and evaluate them with the human mind, we would say that the positive feedback is negative. Why do I say that? Because it is the positive feedback that is continually destabilizing us. The positive feedback is that which is continually bringing fluctuations in. Bringing those fluctuations in. Working together with or in concordance with the homeoraisa. Now the homeoraisa is the, you've heard of the homeoraisa and the homeostasis. the homeoraisa is that which is continual stability in change. All right? That's a paradox, huh? The homeoraisa preserves stability while bringing change. And the homeostasis on the level of Christian Science is that which is also preserving stability. But it does not preserve stability in change in and of itself, only as it works together with the homeoraisa. All right, we'll talk about it. This is what the positive feedback does. Oh, okay. Sorry.